Okay, so we are now live. One more time, thank you very much, Dan, for being here with us and present your work and your research on this really important matter that is food for all of us. So I just will present a small presentation and then I will give you the stage. Dan Saladino is a food journalist and presenter of BBC Radio, the fourth food program. He honed his journalistic skills on Radio 4's investigative series Face the Facts before specializing in food and farming stories more than a decade ago. Then is listed in the Progress 1000, the Evening Standard's most influential people in food and drink, the Telegraph's Food Power List, and he is the recipient of James Baird Awards, America's most high-profile award for food journalism. He has won multiple awards for his radio work, including his efforts to document the loss of biodiversity around the world, in which he has traveled through Europe, Africa, Asia, and Americas, recording the world's most endangered foods and the disappearance of traditional and indigenous food cultures. So thank you for a lot, Dan, for being here, and the stage is yours.
Thank you. Thanks very much for inviting me to give this talk. What I want to try and do is explain the very big picture, the big ideas that I wanted to explore in my book. Ricardo, is it possible that I can share screen? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Let me see if this works. Apologies for the delay here.
No problem.
Okay. Okay. Can you see? Are
Yes.
you seeing what I'm seeing? Yeah. Okay. Does it look like I'm doing the slideshow?
No, it's not moving. It's not moving.
Okay. There we go. Is that moving?
No. Okay. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Well, let me just explain why. Well, a bit more about the work that I do, and also why I wrote this book called Eating to Extinction. And the title is it has a double meaning for me, in that what I'm trying to explain is the way that we are eating globally is leading to an extinction of food traditions, of food cultures and genetic resources, but also the way we are eating is leading to the extinction of biodiversity, and also perhaps even impacting on the future prospects of humanity as well. I make a radio program which is broadcast on the BBC. It's a weekly 30-minute documentary format program. It's not a recipe or a cooking program. It's very much about the economics, the politics, culture, science of food. And it was founded in 1979, so it's more than 40 years old, by a pioneering journalist called Derek Cooper, who wanted, at the time, it was extremely unusual for food to be treated seriously as a journalistic subject. Derek Cooper was a pioneering journalist in recognizing that it was important to be treated as a subject that deserved journalistic inquiry and investigation. I started on the program in 2007, and quite quickly, at a program I was recording in Sicily about citrus, came across an online catalog called the Slow Food Arc of Taste, which was explained to me by farmers in Sicily who were seeing the decline of citrus on the island being produced by small-scale farmers. The reason being that they couldn't compete economically with larger scale production in other parts of Europe. And so we were seeing the decline of fruit growing in parts of the island where it had been for 1,000 years. And obviously it had shaped landscape, it had shaped culture and identity, and also was part of the local economy. But the citrus was only one part of this catalogue of endangered foods, which now has more than 5,000 products in the catalogue from 150 different countries. And imagine any food and there will be an example of an endangered food of that kind in this catalogue, from dairy products to grains to fruit varieties to animal breeds. And the catalogue, again, it was set up in the 1990s by Slow Food, which had itself been created in the 1980s as a reaction, as a response to fast food spreading its way across the world and creating uniformity and more homogeneous food systems around the world. The idea of the ARC was that it's only if we know something is endangered can we do something to save it. The agricultural reason why it's also important, as well as cultural and reasons of identity, is that we've seen the spread of vast monocultures around the world. The most famous example of which are bananas. So the Cavendish banana is now the #1 globally traded banana in the world. And it's one in which that if you find a banana in a supermarket, it's likely to be that type of banana. But there are more than 1,500 different types of banana globally. And the Cavendish banana story is important to understand because it explains that so much of our food has become genetically uniform, and with that comes risk. And what we are seeing around the world in these vast monocultures of the same identical cloned plant is that disease is spreading through the crop, and it's causing fragility in the food system. And in my book, I feature people who are either from a culinary perspective or farming point of view, but also scientists, all trying to save diversity and highlight this problem. And the one I feature in the book is for the banana is a crop scientist and someone who specializes in bananas and the diseases that affect bananas. On social media, you'll find him. He's called Banana Man, but he's based in the Netherlands and working on crop breeding. But his main argument in his work now is that we need to bring diversity back into the banana crop rather than just rely on one type of banana. And so what he's doing is he's taking genetic material, DNA, and by using traditional crop breeding, he's bringing in from the wild a lot of the genes, the traits that were lost in the modern crop. And the reason that's important is because the diseases that are affecting modern bananas are ones which evolved over millions of years with the wild banana plant, which has kept evolving and adapting to the disease. So it's almost as if we need to take some of our crops back in time. This is a familiar idea to many people because it's not a new idea. And a century ago, there was a Russian botanist called Nikolai Vavilov, who was traveling around the world collecting seeds and diversity because he believed that this diversity in our food, so for example, a type of wheat that might be grown in the north of Spain, or a type of wheat that was grown in southern England, each adapted to its different environments and the conditions and the cultures. And he believed that that was a resource that we would need for our future. Meanwhile, in the 20th century, there were other scientists who were finding solutions to the growing risk and concerns over starvation. And so Norman Borlaug is one crop breeder who, in the Green Revolution, which happened after the Second World War, which was a big agricultural boom involving new technology and new crops, managed to create or increase the number of calories being produced around the world. But the way that was done was by creating these highly productive modern breeds of wheat that then spread around the world. Meanwhile, there are other scientists, and here's one who was inspired by Vavilov, Jack Harlan, an American botanist, who was already concerned that the loss of this diversity was going to cause risks in the system. And he spent a lot of time looking at indigenous and traditional food systems to see how they worked and the value of the diversity that they had saved, how that could be brought into the modern farming system. The resources that we have lost, so a lot of crop diversity is stored away in seed banks around the world, backed up in this seed vault, which is in the Arctic Circle, just off of the west coast of Norway. And I've listed here the scale of diversity that's stored in the seed vault. And if you take wheat, 213,000 different unique samples of wheat are in Svalbard. If you are a modern farmer in Europe, it's likely you will be selecting from a list of just 10 pretty similar varieties of wheat that are selected because of their yield and how quickly they can grow. The problem is that those wheats, those modern wheats, depend on a lot of inputs, chemical inputs like fertilizer, pesticides, and irrigation through water. And the problem is that as we face the prospect of climate change, which is happening, that we need to reduce those inputs because they are heavily dependent on fossil fuels. And so in my book, I looked around the world to see what had survived of this crop diversity. And I went to Turkey and as close as I could to the place where wheat first was domesticated by the very first farmers 10,000 years ago. And there they had types of wheat that were domesticated when hunter-gatherers became the first farmers. And when they took wild grasses, one of the wild grasses they selected for created a type of wheat called emmer wheat, which is still being grown in this part of Turkey by a small handful of farmers. Emmer wheat is interesting because it's the wheat that the people who, or the civilization that built the pyramids, that's the type of wheat that they were growing and eating. And likewise it here in the UK, it's the type of wheat that was being planted and grown by the people who erected Stonehenge. So it's a wheat that was around for thousands and thousands of years and led to the rise of many, many different civilizations, but quite quickly has been lost. The reason why it matters is because some of the diseases that are impacting on modern wheats, these traditional wheats can also have traits that can resist more effectively these diseases, but also they are of cultural importance. And there are many different ways in which cultures have shaped these crops, and the crops in turn have shaped the people who eat them. And the different dishes that exist around the world is a reflection of that diversity of the soil, of the crop, of the farming methods, and the way in which people interacted with nature. And in the part of Turkey I was in, they took the wheat and they created a pilaf, almost like a rice, which you see here has been cooked with goose. In Scotland, in the north of Scotland, they have a type of barley. Barley now is mostly used to brew beer or in animal feed, but it was a very important crop for human food, particularly in parts of Northern Europe, but again, has become endangered as a human food. And so there are parts of Scotland that are now bringing back this tradition. And the reason why that's interesting, I think, is because it reflects that wherever you are in the world, there are these traditional crops. that everywhere has its bear barley, which is the wheat, the barley in Scotland, and its kavaljar, which is the wheat in Turkey. I also in the book looked at some of the oldest and most intact forms of food cultures in the world. The most successful food systems that humans have ever created is when we were hunter-gatherers. So if you look at the history of Homo sapiens, 300,000 years, a huge amount of that time, it's only in the last 10,000 years we've switched away from that. But as you can see, that the dominant experience of human beings since the evolution of Homo sapiens has been as hunter-gatherers. And the reason why I looked at hunter-gatherer societies, and I went to Tanzania and spent some time with the Hadza. Only 200 of them are hunter-gatherers now. There's only 1,000 people in the tribe. But diversity is the key to their diet across a year, and they have a diet that consists of a potential menu of 800 different plant and animal species. And I'm also interested in the book in the skills and the knowledge that humans have developed to feed themselves over time, which is why when I was with the Hadza, I looked at their relationship with a bird called the honey guide. Scientific name is indicator. And the number one favorite food of the Hadza is honey. It's possible that honey is the food that made humans the animals that we are, with our big brains and the way we've developed, because it's high energy. And the Hadza could spend hours in the savannah looking for bees' nests, but what they can do is by whistling, the honey guide bird comes to them and will lead them to the locations high up in the trees where the bees' nests are. And the hunter-gatherers will go up using smoke to access the honey, throw down the honey for the members of the tribe to take the honey and eat the honey, which is full of wriggling larvae and crunchy bees, and leave behind for the bird the wax that the bird wants, but the bees make it too dangerous for it to access itself. So what we have here is a collaboration between humans and another species, this bird, that we think could date back in human evolution almost 1 million years. But it could be in our lifetimes that this conversation between a human and a bird is lost because of the impact of the outside world on the Hadza. So they've lost much of their land, and also Western foods are being made available very close to the Hadza population, and so their food system is being challenged by many different pressures. Again, it's a food that's important to the Hadza, but also it shows us that honey has been important in human evolution. I've also traveled to the Andes to look at the origins of potato and other tubers such as oca. And again, it's this idea that human ingenuity and these ways in which humans have survived in very inhospitable conditions and climates that has interested me. And in this case, high up in the Andes, in sometimes harsh, cold conditions, by having this food underground, high energy again, that they domesticated over thousands of years, they managed to settle and survive in these quite harsh conditions. And again, there's huge diversity of tubers there, many more than we'll see in the supermarkets across Europe. And And it's, again, a type of diversity that's disappearing, but many of these tubers will be adapted to different conditions and will have, again, valuable traits such as disease resistance or tolerance to pests and water shortages, for example. Again, more ingenuity and skill to preserve the tubers. They're soaked in water pits to leach out some of the more bitter flavors, and then they're frozen high up in a mountain area, and then by day it will thaw, release water, and daytime, nighttime, daytime, nighttime, it will mean it allows the water to be extracted from the tuber, so it dries out and can be preserved that way. But again, there's people are leaving the land because of pressures on farming and also water shortages. Climate change is impacting on the people in the Andes, so they can no longer grow the same crop in the same place. And what we're seeing here is the loss of biodiversity, and also humans clearing more land to become farmers in different parts of the world. And it's possible, obviously the research is still underway, that's one of the contributory factors to the pandemic. I also look at what the impact of humans out at sea has been. And here we see two different fish. One on the right-hand side, the wild Atlantic salmon, and one being piped through a tube from a fish farm to go out to a loch in Scotland, the farmed fish. There are many reasons why the North Atlantic salmon has become endangered, from pollution of waters to damming rivers, but it's possible that the domesticated fish is impacting on the health of the wild, because in these pens, concentration of lice is a problem, and also chemical buildup. And also the domesticated fish is escaping and possibly weakening the wild gene pool as well. So I think the story of the wild Atlantic salmon is an important one because of the life cycle of the fish as well. It lives the first few years of its life in freshwater rivers. It then changes its body so it can then swim through the sea to its feeding grounds further north in the Atlantic, and then return after that period to the place of its birth back upstream. And because of that, the salmon is telling us the problems that we are creating on land around the rivers, but also out at sea. Climate change is also affecting the fish populations, and so the sources of food for the salmon are changing and causing a problem. So my main argument in the book is that we need to save diversity. We need to save diversity for resilience, to give us options for the future, which is why I was talking about the wheat. We also need to save some of these foods because they are a reflection of thousands and thousands of human evolution and ingenuity, which is why the Hadza and the conversation with the honey guide. And also we need to respect and understand traditional methods of food production because they were often in much greater harmony with nature. And again, the story of the salmon is important there. But we also have the most selfish of reasons as well to save diversity. When people have excavated the bodies of humans who have their remains can be found preserved, really well preserved in bogs, like muddy, moist conditions. They have looked inside their stomachs and found huge diversity of plants. So again, it's only in recent decades, particularly, that human diets have really reduced down to a small number of crops. Humans over time have domesticated 6,000 plants. We now depend on just 9 for most of the world's calories, and more than just 3 wheat, rice, and maize provide more than 50% of global calories. That is a problem because we are learning for our health because of the emerging science of the gut microbiome, which is the trillions of microbes that we all have within our guts. This organ, that's recently been discovered, effectively think of it like an organ in our bodies, that it thrives on diversity and influences our physical and mental health. And as I mentioned with the Hadza, that shows us that we evolved with diversity, and our gut microbiomes can be improved with diversity. And so we all have an individual reason to save food diversity. Okay. There we are. I hope that was not too long and was clear enough.
Thank you so much, Dan. It was perfect. It was perfect. I don't know if there is anyone who has questions for Dan, but I have here one more tricky, another one just to know what you think about this. But did you find, for example, you travel for different parts of the world to research this kind of endangered foods and to try to understand the production and why they are disappearing from our diets, right?
Yeah.
So, but did you focus in specific areas, or can you explain how do you manage this kind of work of identifying this kind of these endangered foods?
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned, the reason why I wrote this particular book was because I had access to this catalogue of endangered foods, which I would recommend anyone to look at. So Slow Food's Arc of Taste, and you can do a drop down menu to wherever you are in the world, and you can see which endangered foods are around you. So I wanted to write a book that was trying to explain why these foods were important in the first place, so how they came into existence, and then why they were disappearing and why they were endangered, and importantly, why did they matter? Why should we care? There are, as I mentioned, there are more than 5,000 of these foods. So in the book, what I wanted to do was to create a narrative story so that you would understand the history of food and the way in which our food is changing through the story of what ended up in the book as being 34 of these endangered foods. And each one had to be a different kind of food. So it couldn't be a book all about cheeses or animal breeds or vegetables. So that was one way I selected the stories. And then I wanted to talk about the origins of food. So that's why Eastern Turkey was important, because of the Fertile Crescent, where wheat was first domesticated. Mexico was also important because of the origins of maize. Also China for the origins of rice. So there were some countries in the book that had to be there because they were just so important in our food history. And then I just made sure that I wanted to have a range of food from each continent. So there are some African stories in there, some from Australia, quite a few from Europe, and so on. So once I'd factored all of those criteria into the selection process, that resulted in some of the travel that I did for the book.
Thank you. And what do you think, in your opinion, what could be our behaviors in the future to change this mindset? What do you think we as consumers, we as, for example, in local communities, what do you think what we can do to change this kind of stuff in bringing these forgotten foods at some point to our tables again?
Yeah, well, again, a lot of this depends on where the readers of the book are in the world, because some parts of the world have held on to more food traditions than others. And I think one message would be to actually value the traditions that still exist, not because they are quaint or for not reasons of nostalgia. And this is the important thing in the book, that these traditions have survived for a reason, and communities have survived as well because of these traditions. So I think I want to make the case that traditions matter, not just because of nostalgia, but because of the genetic resources and the knowledge and the skill. So I think the first thing for us all to do is to know the story, to actually understand that diversity is out there and that it matters, and that it's under threat. So that's why I wrote the book, is because I think we need to know the stories. Secondly, obviously as a consumer, we make many decisions a day about what we're eating and buying from the shops, and where possible, we should be investing in and supporting diversity. So Slow Food have the idea of the co-producer, that we're not just consumers and just people who are buying food. We are co-producers, and we can establish a relationship with a cheesemaker or a baker who's using interesting grains, or a farmer selling meat who's helping to preserve a breed. So we can, where possible, help to save diversity by becoming a co-producer. And then I think we should all choose our favorite foods and really investigate how much diversity is out there, whether it's chocolate or coffee or a type of vegetable. How much diversity is out there to find, and is there diversity that you can help save and support? Which gets onto another level. Where I am, there are many people growing apples in community orchards, trying to save diversity as a community project. That's something that people can get involved in. And then at an even higher level, the way in which cities buy food to feed children in schools, for example. In Copenhagen, they are encouraging farmers to sell them apples, not just based on how cheap they can be or how big they can be or how sweet they can be, but actually how many diverse varieties the farmers can grow. So that's a very powerful thing.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. But there are many things that are out of our control, and we are within a food system that has many powerful forces at play. And so we see billions and billions of dollars globally being spent on farming subsidies and food subsidies. And in a sense, at that level of governments and politics, we need to change the food system, and the mechanisms exist because of those subsidies to make it possible. And the motivation of governments to do that, well, we know we need to reduce carbon emissions because of climate. And we know that agriculture is one of the biggest sources of CO2 emissions. And we know that there are many ways of producing food in traditional systems that require less chemical inputs and carbon, fossil fuels. And so we should be taking modern science and modern technology and using them to get the most out of these more traditional crops and food production techniques.
Yeah, and now we are facing a problem that show us that we are dependent on this small portion of crops, no? Because when we have a war like the one that we are facing now, this problem it becomes more bigger for the societies.
Yeah. So if you look at what's been happening in the build up to the war in Ukraine, so fertilizer prices in some parts of the world have doubled, and that is important because the main reason is energy prices have gone up. And obviously, so much food production around the world is dependent on fertilizers. It became so expensive to produce the fertilizers that in the UK, they actually closed down some manufacturing plants of fertilizers. What that meant is that when they closed down the fertilizer production, one of the byproducts of the process is CO2, which is used to make not just fizzy drinks, but also used to stun animals in abattoirs, in slaughterhouses. And so what you see is that from one event in the world, high energy prices, the knock-on effect through the supply chain and through the food system is huge. And now that was before Ukraine. Ukraine in the Black Sea region is the source of a third of the world's traded wheat. A lot of that wheat is exported to highly vulnerable countries such as Yemen, to huge imports into Egypt and Turkey, other parts of the world. And we know that back in 2010, when there was another spike in wheat prices, that was one of the pressures that led to the Arab Spring and revolutions around the world, because food is so important in terms of global stability. And so we do not know what the impact of this war in Ukraine will be, the ripple effect. And again, Russia is a big source of fertilizer around the world as well. So there will be, it's being predicted there will be a huge agriculture and food shock because of the war.
Okay, anyone has questions?
May I ask a question?
Yes, yes.
Well, thank you so much, and I'm sorry about the
We are
sound
not
when
listening to you.
No, that's okay.
Are you okay?
Yeah, yep.
Yeah, all right. So sorry for the interruption with the sound at the beginning. So I'm when I got in, I'm sorry. So I was wondering, because we were talking about food tourism in previously, and one of the things that I was really interested in is the case of Chile in South America, and how, you know, the production of potatoes. And I was reading some articles about it was 2013, and they were really impressed by the quantity, the varieties, and 90% of the potatoes we have actually are from Chiloé, right? The islands from the country, but they're Spanish speaking. And and I was reading, they were astonished at, why don't you take advantage of that? Why don't you tell the world? And scientists were exploring that, how many varieties. There was a tourist guide that said, oh, we have 400 types of potatoes here. Yeah. And now I was reading in 2020, actually they're more, not only because in 2013, they would have like native potatoes on the menu. They would say like native potatoes, but that's all. There was nothing else. And now I think they're becoming more aware, from what I read, of going back, and that humble food, which is potato, right? That making it more, how do you say, as if it was their heritage to the world.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But did you see any examples from that? Like in terms of tourism, do you have any examples for me? Because I'm really interested in that. How could we, because I know that like in Belgium, there's like a fermentation museum and a cheese museum, and, you know, things where they do attract people but yeah. A museum and a place where you can store, right? Where, as you were saying, talking about the seeds. But
I think the potential is huge. And I think again, this is why the stories matter, to actually know some of the history and to understand this diversity is out there for two reasons, really. One, I think it's just purely that people can buy this food. So as we know from many of the most celebrated chefs in the world, that a lot of the work that they do has revolved around talking about ingredients and diversity, whether, you know, that there are chefs, you know, I think you could think of this, what's happened in the Nordic regions, for example, and the likes of Noma, you know, but also I think that kind of storytelling around diversity has created a huge economic shift around food. And so what was being cooked in a restaurant in Copenhagen was impacting on the lives of people in the remote Faroe Islands to the west. And there was I think, food became a more significant part of the economy again. But when it comes to tourism, again, I think that idea of seeing food as a valuable resource, and so for so long neglected. I think of Georgia and its wine history. So Georgia is possibly the place where wine making originated. They've got a lot of wild grapes there that show us that the origins of the fruit, possibly winemaking technologies that go back 8,000 years. And today we think that there are 500 grape varieties there. One of the reasons why Georgia became more attractive for people wanting to travel and for tourism is because after the communist era in the late 90s and into the early 2000s, they had a new generation of winemakers. And in fact, some of those winemakers are people who arrived in Georgia because they were interested in researching polyphonic singing, and they became obsessed with the winemaking. They became winemakers, and they have, if you look at the media coverage they have generated by building on this tradition, this ancient tradition that almost disappeared by the 1980s, they have again created a really powerful economic tool for the country to use. And I find that everywhere, wherever I've gone. And technology as well is part of this. So there's a rice story in the book, a farmer in a remote part of southern China who'd saved a particular type of red rice variety. And I was thinking, how is he selling this rice? There's no market close to him. And he took, quite an elderly farmer, took out his phone, and he was on, he had an app called WeChat, and he was selling this endangered rice to people in Beijing and in Chengdu and other cities as well. So I think, endangered foods, this disappearing diversity has huge value, but also for people interested in food, a different kind of value in a sense that, one in which we want to buy into and experience and possibly even see in production.
Thank you so much.
So
thank you.
we have a question here on Facebook. The question is there anything done on that subject of saving biodiversity by government policies?
Well, I mentioned the story in Copenhagen of a city doing that. In Brazil, for a very long time, there was a policy that 30% of school food in parts of the country had to come from local small-scale family farms. So you do see policies where there is a commitment to that kind of farming, and also I'm trying to so I think that there is global investment, nation by nation, in the seed banks. So again, there's an understanding that this genetic resource needs to be saved. So all the seed vault, that was mostly funded by the Norwegian government. They understood the importance of saving diversity. And also in the UK, there's a huge amount of investment going into research centres like Kew Botanic Gardens, the Royal Botanic Gardens in Kew, where they're doing a lot of research on, so for example, getting the wild wheats from Turkey and getting the traits that could be the resistance we need to diseases in the modern wheats. So governments are investing in diversity. I just need to get my plug because of I'm worried about my battery dying. So I'm still with you, but I'm just going to get,
Okay, thank you.
I can still hear
Anyone
you.
has questions here? Okay.
So
I can hear you. I can hear you. Yep. There we are.
Okay, so I have one question. Is so the subject of our master now is sustainability,
Mhm.
and I was trying to connect a little bit of our project with our project. And my question for you is, so from all the countries and continents you've been to, is the solution to plant more species to diverse our diet, or to eat less?
Is it just me, or I can't hear?
No, he's blocked. Can you repeat the question?
Can you hear me now?
Yep, I can hear you.
All right.
So,
So what I was telling
is the solution to save more species, or and carry on with that?
so so the solution is to plant more species to diverse our diet, or to eat less. In this case, eat less, I'm talking about maybe eating a little bit less meat than we are eating now, eating in a more healthy way.
I think I have your question, and I think the answer is all of those things. So just taking them, sustainability through diversity. Well, there's a story in the book of probably one of the most humble foods you can imagine. It's a lentil, and it was grown for many centuries, possibly thousands of years, in southern Germany. And what this lentil made it possible. Again, this is quite a harsh, high altitude place in the Swabian Alps, and the lentil was the way in which people survived there and managed to settle, because you can't grow huge amounts of cereal crops there. But for various reasons, Germany industrializing, Canada became a big lentil producer. And by the way, it was part of their identity and their culture. It was a delicious, I've tried this lentil, and it's different to any other lentil I've tasted as well. But by the 1970s, it was extinct. And one farmer actually traveled to Russia to go to the Vavilov seed bank and find the seeds to bring it back again. Why does that matter in terms of sustainability? Well, it meant that they could also bring back a farming system of crop rotation, where the lentils were fertilizing the soil to grow other crops, rather than having to put lots of fertilizer in. And obviously we know that pulses, legumes, including lentils, are highly nutritious as well. And that story of a German farmer bringing back this lost legume, bean, inspired other people in different parts of Europe to research what had once grown in their part of the world. In Sweden, there were people who researched peas and beans and brought some back. And then that story inspired people in England who were trying to think of a more sustainable food system for Britain. And they again researched what had disappeared when it came to peas and beans. And they discovered that fava beans were being grown in Britain thousands of years ago, and that there are some peas and beans that were being grown in the Iron Age that went extinct because we had more access to meat, is one of the reasons, as a source of protein. And they've brought back peas and beans, and they've created this amazing logo, made it a really modern looking food, and they're telling the story of what it means for farmers. So I think the idea that there are foods in our history that were good for us, good for the soil, good for the planet, that we've neglected, and beans are, peas and beans are an example of that. I think, there are parts of the world where clearly they have survived and are much prized and treasured. And the radio program I work on, interestingly enough, one of my colleagues has just come back from Spain after making a program about the status and the importance of beans there and the diversity that still exists. So so I think diversity matters and can help in terms of sustainability. You mentioned meat. there's a section in the book on meat, and I talk about the way in which, you know, this interconnection between the boom in meat production in the last 100 years. If you think about pork production and poultry production, that process that I mentioned with crops, where we really narrowed down the selection to the high yielding varieties, that's the case with all the animals in farms around the world now, in that there was a process, particularly after the Second World War, where the genetics of one pig really dominates most global pork production. There are 3 breeds of chicken, or 3 genetic lines of chicken, that dominate most poultry production around the world, owned by just 2 companies. And obviously that's then connected to all of the feed, all of the arable, so a lot of the grain that's grown around the world, and also the soybeans grown around the world. So that's why you get into the arguments about deforestation. And so meat that's produced on mixed farms, where the animal is part of a system, rather than what we have done is we've taken animals out of the farm and then we've put them into factories, and then we've taken food from other parts of the world and brought them to the animal, rather than the animal being on the farm, creating fertility with its manure, or consuming food waste, as in the case of pigs. And then you know, that cycle of that natural cycle of nutrients in a mixed farm system is one that's disappearing around the world. And so there are forms of meat production that are more beneficial than the ones that we've ended up with, which are extremely intensive and high cost for the planet. So yeah, I think sustainability and these endangered foods, it's very much what lessons from the past can tell us about how to feed ourselves. Not that we need to go back into the past, but that the past can inform us of how there are better ways of farming and producing food.
Thank you very much. Anyone has questions, more questions for Dan? No? Yeah.
You talk a little bit about the seed vaults. I'm not that aware about how they work, but in these situations of catastrophes, like we see the war in Ukraine, could some of the seeds be used on the rebuilding of the community to help ground, since, like, for example, the wheat is the very fast grower?
Yeah, no, that's exactly why they were created, to save the genetic resources and for them to be used by crop breeders, so that they have an agricultural use. But these seed banks around the world, some are maintained very well, and some of the seeds can be viable after many years. Some are not so well maintained, which is why this seed vault Svalbard was created as a backup. And what we saw during the war in Syria effectively, the war there led to its seed collection being threatened, and so that was moved to Lebanon, again, and not a particularly stable place. But the first seeds to be withdrawn from the seed vault in Svalbard were to replace what was lost in Syria. So again, that's exactly why this matters, because in a war, as you've said, so much can be lost, is being lost, and farmers will leave the land, crops will not be replanted, and one farmer might be saving a very particular kind of seed. So these seed banks matter, and they need to be maintained so the seeds remain viable. So they are important for governments to invest in. But yeah, they have been used, and Syria is an example of how they are used, have been used.
Thank you so much.
Okay, then thank you so much one more time for being here with us. I already read your book. It's very interesting.
Thank you.
So, Eating to Extinction: The World's Rarest Foods and Why We Need to Save Them. This was a short conversation about all the needs that our food systems need for the future, because we also believe that all of us has some kind of contribution to restore the food system, and it needs to start in us and then spread into our community. So it was a pleasure, really, Dan, to have you here, and thank you so much for this conversation and this presentation of you. Thank you.
Thanks for inviting me, and good luck with everyone. Take care.
Thank you.